I was still staring at the broken pieces of my necklace on the hardwood floor when my father held out his hand like nothing unusual had happened. "Well," he said, "the keys, Natalie." 40 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My mother stood inches away, her chest rising with anger. The sting from her slap still burned across my cheek. "You embarrassed this family long enough," she snapped. "Hand your brother the beach house keys and sit back down." My older brother, David, didn't say a word. He just waited, as if the house I'd spent 12 years saving for had already become his. I slowly bent down, picked up the tiny silver pendant that had broken off my necklace, and slipped it into my pocket. "I already answered," I said quietly. "No." Gasps rippled through the room. Before we continue, drop your city and country in the comments below. And if you enjoy revenge stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Without another word, I walked past my parents, through the front door, and out into the driveway. Behind me, I heard my father yell my name, followed by relatives insisting I come back and apologize. Instead, I unlocked my phone. I tapped one contact. One button. Then I put the phone away. 25 minutes later, while my entire family was still inside deciding what they thought they could force me to do, a woman they'd never seen before walked through the front door, carrying a leather folder. And the very first thing she said was, "You have exactly 5 minutes to stop interfering with my client's property rights." Until that afternoon, I'd spent my entire life believing that if I worked hard enough, stayed respectful enough, and sacrificed enough, eventually my parents would treat me the same way they treated my brother. I was 37 years old before I finally accepted they never would. The reunion had been my aunt's idea. Nearly everyone in the family had come: uncles, cousins, grandparents, nieces, nephews. More than 40 relatives packed into my parents' backyard for what was supposed to be an easy summer weekend together. The beach house naturally became a topic of conversation. I'd bought it 3 years earlier after my architecture firm landed a major commercial project. It wasn't some inherited family property or lucky investment. Every mortgage payment had come out of my own account. Every renovation had been paid for with weekends I spent working instead of taking vacations. Still, my mother never called it Natalie's beach house. She always smiled and said, "Our family's beach house." I corrected her politely the first few times. Eventually, I stopped bothering. That afternoon, everyone gathered around the long dining table after lunch. My father stood, tapped his glass with a spoon, and smiled like he was about to make a toast. "I've been thinking about what's best for this family," he announced. The conversations died down. David looked confused. So did I. Then my father looked directly at me. "Natalie," he said, "bring me your beach house keys." A few relatives laughed, assuming he was joking. He wasn't. My mother stood beside him and folded her arms. "David needs that house more than you do," she said. "He's between jobs, you're successful. It's only fair." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" My father sighed dramatically. "You heard your mother." The room grew quiet. "I bought that house," I answered carefully. "And you're still our daughter," my mother replied. "Families share." "I've shared plenty." "This isn't a negotiation." David finally spoke. "I mean," he said with a shrug, "honestly, I figured you'd give it to me eventually." I stared at him. "You figured I'd give you the house I paid for." My father nodded as though that were the most reasonable thing in the world. "Exactly." When I refused, my mother's expression changed instantly. "You've become selfish," she hissed. I said no. The slap came so fast I barely saw it. The crack echoed across the room. My necklace snapped, scattering across the hardwood floor as relatives froze in complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. I picked up the broken pendant. Then I walked away. Now, 25 minutes later, every conversation inside the reunion stopped again, as the unfamiliar woman entered carrying a leather portfolio. She calmly surveyed the room before fixing her eyes on my parents. "You have exactly 5 minutes," she said evenly, "to stop interfering with my client's property rights." No one in my family had any idea who she was. But I did. And everything was about to change. The room stayed silent after the woman spoke. I remained outside on the driveway, watching through the front window. My phone buzzed once. "Karen Ellis, I'm here." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Seeing Karen standing inside that dining room brought back the conversation we'd had 4 months earlier. The day I finally admitted to myself that my parents weren't just crossing boundaries anymore. They were preparing to take something that wasn't theirs. It had started with little comments. We were eating dinner after church when my mother smiled across the table. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee, "that beach house has enough bedrooms for David to live there." I laughed because I thought she was joking. "He has an apartment. For now." My father nodded. "Besides, you hardly use the place." "I was there last weekend." "But you work so much," my mother replied. "David would actually appreciate it." I changed the subject. At the time, I convinced myself it was just another example of my parents favoring him. It wasn't. Over the next several weeks, the comments became questions. "What insurance company do you use? Did you finance the house or buy it outright? Who keeps an extra set of keys? Have you updated your will yet?" Each question sounded innocent by itself. Together, they made me uneasy. One afternoon, my best friend, Melissa, was helping me repaint one of the guest bedrooms. I repeated the latest conversation with my parents while we rolled fresh paint onto the walls. She stopped mid-stroke. "Natalie." "What?" "Listen to everything you just told me." I frowned. "They keep asking about paperwork." So they aren't asking because they're curious." She lowered the roller and looked directly at me. "They're gathering information." I wanted to argue. Instead, I realized I couldn't. The next weekend, my parents came to visit the beach house. I hadn't invited them. They said they were just driving through. Within minutes, my father was opening closet doors and inspecting rooms. This guest room would work perfectly for David. My mother stood on the back deck, overlooking the ocean. He could rent it out during the summer, she mused. That would solve his money problems. I folded my arms. "You're talking like he already owns it." My mother smiled without looking at me. "Well, one day he probably will." "No." She finally turned. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean exactly that." For the first time all afternoon, neither of them spoke. A week later, I scheduled a meeting with an estate attorney. Karen Ellis welcomed me into her office with a professional smile. "So," she said, opening a legal pad, "what brings you here today?" I took a slow breath. "I think my parents are planning to pressure me into giving away my house." She didn't interrupt. I explained every conversation, every question, every assumption they'd made about David living there someday. When I finished, Karen leaned back thoughtfully. "You've documented these conversations." "I started recently." "Good." She nodded once. "Then let's make sure your property stays exactly where you intend it to." Over the next hour, we discussed legal options. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan that would prevent anyone from manipulating ownership through guilt, family pressure, or intimidation. As Karen organized the paperwork, she looked at me over the edge of the folder. "One question." I looked up. "Are you absolutely certain your own parents would go that far?" I wanted to answer immediately. Instead, I hesitated. "I don't know," I admitted to Karen after a long silence. "I hope I'm wrong." She closed the folder gently. "I hope you are too." At the time, I walked out of her office believing I'd probably wasted my money. I had no idea how quickly I would prove myself right. Back at the reunion, my father was still standing at the head of the dining table like he was presiding over a family meeting, instead of demanding someone else's property. He looked around the room before speaking again. I think everyone here understands why we're asking Natalie to do this. Several relatives nodded. One of my uncles spoke first. David's had a rough few years. An aunt added, Natalie, you've always been the successful one. Another cousin smiled sympathetically. You can always buy another vacation house. I looked from face to face. No one asked whether I wanted to give it away. They were only discussing why I should. My mother stepped beside my father and folded her hands dramatically. We raised our children to put family first. She turned toward the relatives. Didn't we? A chorus of agreement followed. She looked back at me. So don't make this difficult. I felt every eye in the room settle on me. This wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. And I had been cast as the selfish daughter before I'd even walked through the front door. Then David finally spoke. He rubbed the back of his neck and shrugged. I honestly thought this had already been decided. I stared at him. What are you talking about? He looked genuinely confused. Mom and Dad said you understood. They told me you'd probably transfer everything before the end of the year. The room became noticeably quieter. I slowly turned toward my parents. You told him that. Neither of them denied it. My father simply answered. We assumed you'd do the right thing. As people shifted uncomfortably around the table, something caught my eye. Near the end of the buffet sat a spiral notebook. Its pages were open. Across the top, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words. David's beach house plans. My pulse slowed instead of racing. I walked over and picked it up. Inside were pages of handwritten notes. Replace guest room furniture. Expand deck. Convert office into David's bedroom. Summer rental income estimate. Boat storage options. None of it was written as an idea. Every page assumed the house already belonged to him. I looked up. When did you write this? My mother reached for the notebook. Give me that. I stepped back. When? She didn't answer. Instead, one of my cousins leaned forward. You've already been planning renovations. An awkward silence spread across the room. I finally understood. This reunion had never been about asking. They had invited more than 40 relatives for one reason. If enough people watched, if enough people agreed, if enough people judged me, they believed I'd surrender the house to avoid embarrassing the family. The public pressure wasn't spontaneous. It had been planned. Every conversation, every speech, every sympathetic comment, every seat around that table. It had all been arranged before I ever arrived. I closed the notebook and placed it carefully back on the table. Then I looked directly at my parents. My answer is still no. The smile disappeared from my mother's face. You ungrateful girl. I paid for that house. We're your parents. And that doesn't make it yours. The words had barely left my mouth when she stepped forward. Her hand struck my face with a crack loud enough to silence every conversation. Pain exploded across my cheek. My necklace snapped, scattering silver across the hardwood floor. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, Diane. My father pointed toward me without looking at his wife. Hand over the keys before you leave. I bent down, picked up the broken pendant and stood. No. I walked past every stunned relative, through the front door, and into the afternoon sunlight. No one tried to stop me. 25 minutes later, a dark sedan rolled slowly into the driveway. The driver's door opened. Karen Ellis stepped out, carrying the same leather portfolio I'd seen months earlier. She met my eyes. There was no panic in her voice, only certainty. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly, "for me to enforce the agreement?" "I am," I said. Karen gave a single nod. "Then stay with me." Together, we walked toward the front door. The conversations inside were loud again. I could hear my father's voice over everyone else's. "She'll cool off, she always does." Karen reached for the handle. "You don't need to argue with anyone," she said quietly. "I'll handle the legal side." Then she opened the door. The room fell silent almost immediately. 40 relatives turned toward us. Karen stepped inside with the calm confidence of someone who wasn't intimidated by angry families or raised voices. "Good afternoon," she said. "My name is Karen Ellis." No one answered. She continued. "I represent Natalie Brooks regarding the ownership and protection of her beach house." My father frowned. "And who invited you?" "Natalie did." He laughed once. "This is a family matter." Karen didn't react. "No, Mr. Brooks, it is a property matter." My mother crossed her arms. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns my client." She placed her leather portfolio on the dining table and opened it. Several neatly organized documents appeared. My father glanced at them dismissively. "You lawyers always make simple things complicated." Karen looked directly at him. "Actually, your actions made this complicated." The room became even quieter. Richard straightened his shoulders. "I'm her father." Karen nodded politely. "I understand. Parents have authority over family property." She paused, just long enough for everyone to hear what came next. "You have authority over property you own." She slid the first document across the table. "You do not own the beach house." My father didn't touch it. My mother spoke instead. "She's our daughter." "Yes. And families help each other." Karen folded her hands. "Helping someone is voluntary." She looked around the room. "Being pressured into surrendering real estate is not." Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Karen removed another document. "Over the past several months, my client documented repeated conversations regarding attempts to persuade, pressure, or guilt her into transferring ownership of her property." My father's expression changed. "What conversations?" Karen calmly listed them. The repeated requests regarding insurance. The inquiries about spare keys. The discussions about changing ownership. The statements telling third parties the home would eventually belong to David. Every sentence landed harder than the last. I watched my mother's confidence begin to fade. She hadn't expected anyone outside the family to know those details. One of my uncles looked toward my parents. "Wait, those conversations actually happened." No one answered him. Karen continued. "My client sought legal advice after recognizing a consistent pattern." She held up another signed document. Additional protections were established to ensure no transfer of ownership could occur through family coercion. David finally found his voice. "What does that even mean?" Karen turned toward him. "It means no amount of family pressure can change who owns the property." He stared at the papers. I didn't know any of this." For the first time all afternoon, he sounded less confident than confused. Karen carefully placed one final document in front of my parents. "This provision was created for one specific circumstance." My father narrowed his eyes. "What circumstance?" She answered without hesitation. "If intimidation or physical aggression occurred during an attempt to influence ownership." My mother's face lost its color. Karen didn't need to point out what everyone in the room had already witnessed. The slap. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew exactly why this document now mattered. Karen closed the folder. "Effective immediately, all communication regarding this property must go through my office." She looked first at my parents, then around the room. No member of this family may enter, occupy, advertise, rent, borrow, or claim authority over the beach house without my client's express authorization. She turned to me. Natalie. Yes. Do you wish to activate the enforcement provisions we discussed? Every relative watched me. A few hours earlier, my parents had expected me to fold under public pressure. Now they were the ones waiting for my answer. I met Corinne's eyes. Yes. She nodded once. It's done. Before anyone could speak, a voice came from the far end of the table. An elderly aunt slowly stood, looking first at my parents, then at the documents spread across the table. She frowned. Hold on. The room froze. She looked directly at Richard and Diane. Nobody told us this wasn't really about helping David. The room stayed silent after my Aunt Alina spoke. Her question hung in the air longer than any argument had. Nobody told us this wasn't really about helping David. For the first time that afternoon, no one rushed to defend my parents. My father looked around the room, searching for the support he'd counted on. Instead, he found 40 people waiting for an explanation. Corinne broke the silence. Since there seems to be some confusion, she said evenly, I'll explain exactly why these legal protections exist. She opened one final section of her folder. Several months ago, Corinne began, Ms. Brooks consulted my office after repeated attempts were made to convince her that she had a moral obligation to transfer ownership of her beach house. She looked toward my parents. At that time, there had been no crime, no lawsuit, and no emergency. She turned back to the family. There was simply a pattern. She calmly listed it. Repeated conversations, suggesting the house should become David's. Questions about ownership documents. Inquiries about insurance policies. Discussions of extra keys. Statements to relatives implying a transfer had already been agreed upon. The notebook filled with renovation plans. Every incident by itself seemed harmless. Together, they painted a very different picture. Corinne continued. My client was concerned that emotional pressure would eventually become public coercion. She paused. Today's events confirmed those concerns. My mother finally spoke. We were only trying to help our son. Corinne nodded politely. Helping your son is your choice. She glanced at me. Taking your daughter's property is not. No one argued. Because no one could. David slowly lowered himself into a chair. He rubbed both hands across his face. You really thought she was giving me the house? One of my cousins asked him. He looked embarrassed. I did. He shook his head. They kept telling me she understood. He looked toward me for the first time all afternoon. Natalie, I never promised you anything. I know. His voice barely carried across the room. I know that now. For the first time in years, I saw my brother without our parents speaking for him. He looked less entitled than defeated. Not because he had lost a beach house. Because he'd finally realized he'd built expectations on promises that were never mine to make. My father tried one last time. So that's it. He looked directly at me. You're choosing paperwork over your own family. I answered before Corinne could. No. I met his eyes. I'm choosing truth over manipulation. No one interrupted. I'm done pretending that sacrificing more will finally earn your approval. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. Corinne gathered her documents. One final matter. She handed me a copy of the trust paperwork. As of today, all future communication regarding the property will come through my office. She turned toward my parents. If you attempt to interfere again, appropriate legal remedies are available. Her tone never changed. It didn't need to. The message was unmistakable. Relatives who had pressured me earlier now quietly approached. My uncle cleared his throat. "Natalie, I owe you an apology." "So do I." My aunt admitted. "We thought your parents were asking for temporary help. No one told us they expected you to give away the entire house." Several others nodded. One by one, the people who had stayed silent began acknowledging what they'd witnessed. Not just the slap. Years of favoritism they had overlooked because it happened gradually. David walked over before I left. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have questioned what they were telling me." "You should have." He nodded. "I've already started looking for work again." I believed him. For once, he wasn't waiting for someone else to solve his problems. My parents didn't apologize. Not that day. Not the next week. Not the months that followed. Instead, they discovered something they had never experienced before. Their pressure no longer worked. Family gatherings became smaller. Other relatives volunteered to host them instead. No one wanted another reunion built around humiliation and demands. The authority my parents had relied on for decades quietly disappeared. As for me, I repaired the necklace. Not because it was expensive. It wasn't. But every time I fastened it around my neck, I remembered the moment I stopped confusing obedience with love. The beach house stayed exactly where it had always belonged. Mine. A few months later, I invited close friends there for a quiet weekend by the ocean. We cooked together, watched the sunset from the deck, laughed without walking on eggshells. For the first time since buying the house, it truly felt like home. Not because the view had changed, because the weight I'd carried for most of my life was finally gone. My mother thought that slap would force me to surrender the one thing I'd worked hardest to build. Instead, it became the moment I finally reclaimed something far more valuable. My freedom.